Welcome to meeting number 56 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room as well as remotely through Zoom. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please do mute yourselves when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom is at the bottom of your screens, and you do have a choice of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. In accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of our meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motions adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022 and Thursday, February 2nd, 2023, the committee is holding a briefing with the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations. Now it's my great honor to welcome to our committee His Excellency Robert Ray, who is our Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Ambassador Ray, we're very grateful you're joining us today. You do have 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will open it to the members for questions. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to give a brief report and then answer any of your questions. I appreciate very much the opportunity. My work began in the summer of 2020. As Canada, the world, and the UN were faced with a series of difficult challenges, including the worst global pandemic since 1918, the highest number of refugees and displaced people since the end of World War II, serious conflicts both within and between countries, exacerbated by the presence of extremist groups and authoritarian governments, climate change, and the financial, economic, and social consequences of all of these cascading crises. En tant qu'ambassadeur,
as ambassador, I lead a diverse and talented team of Foreign Service officers, members of Canada's armed forces and police, as well as experts in supporting our needs in the fields of communications, technology, information, and our responsibility to host a myriad of events, visits, and conferences over a full schedule throughout the year. When I first arrived in New York, the United Nations and Canada's offices in New York were affected by COVID-19. We are now operating at full speed and on all cylinders. My first obligation is to lead this team, coordinate our operations with headquarters in Ottawa, and to ensure that our work is conducted with integrity and intelligence. I am very proud of how we represent Canada and Canadians.
Include serving as chair of the Peacebuilding Commission from 2020 to 2021, serving as chair of the ECOSOC Advisory Committee on Haiti throughout my time in New York, chairing a number of group of friends, including those on Afghanistan, Myanmar, children in armed conflict, and financing for development. I've also served as chair of the New York Working Group of the Assembly of States Parties of the International Criminal Court, which means I also serve as vice president of the Assembly from 2021 to the end of this year. In July of this year, Canada will assume the vice presidency of ECOSOC, which together with the General Assembly and the Security Council is a UN body whose responsibilities are set out in the UN Charter. In the ordinary course of events, Canada could expect to assume the presidency of ECOSOC in 2024-25. Several additional crises have profoundly affected the course of our work as a mission. Both Iraq and Syria have been the source of ongoing issues involving conflict and displacement and refugee issues. The collapse of the elected government of Afghanistan, the takeover by the Taliban the summer of 2021, has created hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees, and the treatment of women has led to the allegation of gender apartheid. We've been dealing with difficult issues affecting women in Iran, Afghanistan. In keeping with our feminist foreign assistance policy, it remains the focus of our activity. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to millions of refugees internally displaced and to ongoing debates and discussions in the UNGA. The growing humanitarian political crisis in Haiti involves Canada directly in many discussions. Myanmar and the Rohingya crisis have led to major issues of conflict, humanitarian disaster, and important questions of accountability. We see the same thing happening in the Sahel. There are human rights crises in Iran, Afghanistan, China, and many other places. We raise these on a consistent basis. We also have to deal with the displacement issue in Venezuela, Colombia, and Central America. This world in turmoil has had a substantial effect on our work as a mission, and in my role as both as an advisor to the ministers in GAC and the Prime Minister and his staff, and of course my role as ambassador here. Le monde est profondément.
The world is a deeply troubled place at the moment, and my responsibility is both to report to Ottawa on the consequences of wars, conflicts, financial collapses, shifting loyalties, and complex events, and to help to explain to Canadians, members of the UN, and an active civil society how we see the world. My role deals with traditional diplomacy and also defending our interests and our values. As head of the Canadian mission, I am proud to reflect Canada's views on human rights, the rule of law, gender equality, Canada's feminist foreign assistance policy, peace and conflict, climate change, and other compelling issues of the day. I'm also proud to be able to reflect Canada's views in any number of closed-door conversations among both like-minded countries and countries that often disagree with us, as well as with each other.
In the time available, I would also say that I'm happy to return to the committee whenever that is helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We will now go to the members for questions. The first member is MP Genis. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador Ray, and I'm pleased to hear that you're happy to return to the committee again in the future. There are many issues, and it has taken a while to book you, but anyways, I'll leave that there. We welcome you back again. I want to start by asking about genocide recognition. We know that when the House of Commons recognizes a genocide, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Government of Canada recognizes that genocide, nor does it mean that it's advocating for that recognition internationally. And your office could play an important role advocating for genocide recognition in certain cases on the world stage. But there have been a number of recent cases of genocide recognition in the House where the government has not commented either way. So I want to ask, in regards to certain specific instances, whether your office is advocating for broader international recognition of those genocide and what the position of the Government of Canada is. So let's start with the Tamil genocide at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. Does the Government of Canada regard this as a genocide, and is your office advocating for broader genocide recognition?
It's not just my office, Mr. Genis. It's also our office in Geneva, which is very involved in the issue of what's happened to the Tamils. I've been very involved with this issue since my work at the Forum of Federations, going back to the end of the end of the last century. So this has been a long time coming. There's two questions around recognition. One is, do we describe things as a genocide in our speeches and in our comments? The answer is yes. The second is the official or formal recognition of a genocide is something that takes place between states parties at the ICJ, as the International Court of Justice, as you well know. So the UN itself does not normally make a declaration in the General Assembly with respect to that question, but it is something which we do not hesitate to mention in our speeches, whether it's to do with the situation affecting the Tamils or the situation affecting the Uyghurs or many, many other situations with which, if I may say so, given our friendship over the years, both you and I are very familiar. So, yes, it is something that we discuss on a frequent basis.
Yeah. Thank you. If I can just sharpen the question to be precise, though, is it the position of the Government of Canada that genocide did take place towards Tamils at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War?
Not that I'm aware of. I've not seen that as an official position of the government. It doesn't take away in any respect from our ability as a delegation to refer specifically to the situation involving the Tamils, which, as you may know, is something with which I'm extremely familiar.
But do you use the word genocide when you refer to that situation in your dialogue with other countries or in your speeches? Are you able to use?
I have done.
Okay.
And I don't hesitate to have very candid discussions with other countries on that subject as well as on a number of others.
Right. So you use the word genocide, and at the same time, you're not familiar with the government of Canada taking that official position around recognition, but you don't see the lack of recognition by the government as an impediment to you using the word genocide in the course of your conversations. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
Is the same broadly true of the Uyghur genocide?
Well, we've been very actively involved in Canada. In fact, led the way in the gathering together of a number of countries. I think we're now up to over 50 who've agreed with us with respect to writing a very strong letter to making a very strong declaration with a number of other countries on the situation affecting the Uyghurs. The fact that Parliament has stated that something is a genocide is something that I would frequently refer to in my own public speeches and utterances. I have no hesitation in using the word.
Okay, so it sounds like it's broadly the same, where you use the word, but the government of Canada, recognition is, and it seems to me that maybe sends a little bit of a confusing message, but I'd certainly rather you use the word than not use the word. So in that sense, I would encourage you in that, even if it maybe goes beyond the parameters in terms of the words used by the minister. Ambassador, I want to ask you just
if I may, just on that question, Mr. Gunn, I don't interrupt you, but on the Rohingya situation, for example, as you know, the government of Canada is now intervening at the ICJ on the Rohingya genocide case.
We'll keep pushing on that. But just in the time I have left, I want to add in one more question, which is I'm hearing a lot of concern from people various places in Canada about the situation in India. I wonder if you can share with us what the government of Canada's position is with respect to the current situation in Punjab and in India in general, and just what your perspective, what the government's perspective is on unfolding events.
Well, that's a huge topic. India is its largest democracy in the world. It has a democratically elected government. The government of India is one that we have a strong and powerful relationship with as a government. They're a federal country. There's a tremendous amount of diversity in India. So no, the simple answer is. Do we comment on the human rights situation in India? Not officially. Do I have conversations with other members of the General Assembly about what's happening in India? Of course I do. But I think it's a situation that I would distinguish from some of the others that you've mentioned in terms of how we respond to the situation in India.
Yeah, obviously it's distinct. Can you share with us the nature of those conversations you're having, though? Just as in the interest of transparency, so we have an understanding of what is being said on our behalf?
Well, I think there's an ongoing debate in India itself about the question of nationalism and how that populist nationalism is expressed and what the treatment of various minorities in the country is. But I don't equate that situation in the same way as I do with some others. Obviously, as you may know, I was asked by the government of Canada 15 years ago, more than 17 years ago, to look at the Air India bombing, and I became quite familiar with the challenges that gave rise to that situation, that tragic situation. And I've always felt that it's important for us to fully appreciate the fact that India has an elected government, and it's a government that's elected and re-elected, in which elections are challenged in India and at the federal level in India as well as in all the states. So it's a very different approach, if you like, than we would take to some other situations where the governments are not elected, the governments are not democratic, they're highly repressive. One has to deal with these situations with a great deal of sensitivity and understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We next go to MP Sarai. You have 6 minutes, Mr. Sarai.
Ambassador Ray, good to see you back. Always a pleasure to have you here on our committee. I'm going to ask you more in respects to what happened in the Ukraine. If you can walk us through the horrible day when Russia illegally launched an invasion into Ukraine, perhaps what were you doing at the time? Who did you talk to? What did your multilateral engagement look like? And what were your counterparts thinking at the time? If you can enlighten us, that would be great.
Well, as you may know, Randy, if I may, I was here in New York. We were watching very carefully with a great deal of concern the growing speculation that Russia could in fact launch an attack on Ukraine. The Security Council was meeting at the very time in the evening, at the very time that the war was launched. The Russian member of the committee was not aware, and the chairman of the committee at the time was not aware of the fact that this was about to happen. I don't believe he knew, and in any event, certainly didn't indicate that he had any idea about it. And as it unfolded in that evening, it became clear that the attack was going to be a very direct assault on Kyiv, on the capital of Ukraine. And as opposed to much speculation that the war would be limited to ongoing conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk, what we saw right away was that this was going to be a massive attack. A number of us were there together talking with each other about how we would respond, and the answer was that we were going to do everything we could to make sure that, because we knew the Russians would exercise a veto over anything that the Security Council might or might not be able to do, we immediately discussed how the center of action had to shift to the General Assembly, which is exactly what happened. And we were very much part of those conversations and discussions about how we would proceed together, what the resolutions in the General Assembly would look like, and how we would begin to mobilize international support for what was taking place. At the same time as we needed to start having conversations with the Secretariat, with the organization known as OCHA, which is the Humanitarian Coordinating Agency of the UN, about how we would have to be able to mobilize all of the on-the-ground efforts to support people who would be so much affected by the war as it unfolded. And obviously, I was in constant conversation with officials in Ottawa, both on the phone and through emails, et cetera, talking about how we would be coordinating our activity and what it would mean, as well as activities which would be taking place in Geneva and elsewhere. So it was a very busy time. February 24th is not a date I'm going to forget very easily. It was a very dramatic moment.
Ambassador Ray, can you also tell us what your conversations with your counterparts are with respect to the sanctions, the military aid, the humanitarian aid that has been given to Ukraine? Has it been effective? Has there been repercussions, in terms of some of the countries that are, typically receiving potash or fertilizer or grains from that region? Has there been a domino effect in terms of any negative impact on them, and vice versa? Has the impact been weakening Russia in regards to its aggression against Ukraine?
Well, on the question of the overall impact, I think there's no question that the fallout from the war in its economic and social impact has been enormous. It's been enormous on Ukraine. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine remains extremely difficult. Bombs can come at you anywhere in the country at any time. And it's clear that Russians have been targeting civilian infrastructure and civilian sites. They've killed thousands and thousands of people, innocent people who are not involved in the conflict. It's had a traumatic impact on Ukraine, but it's also had a strong economic and social impact on the rest of the world, because Ukraine is a major, as you pointed out, is a major supplier of food and a major supplier of fertilizer. The ports in Ukraine have been widely used through the Black Sea to get food products throughout the world. Those supply lines were disrupted. The number of the ports, including Mariupol, were completely and utterly destroyed. Russians have continued to bomb in Odessa, despite the fact that there's a deal now to get the grain out. So, I mean, the impacts have been extraordinary on the, as I said, on the people of Ukraine, but globally, and naturally, globally, there, I have to say, there was a perception expressed by a number of countries that, well, the West is responding this way to Ukraine, to Ukrainian refugees, to the humanitarian needs, the amount of aid that we're supplying, but when it comes to our situation, we don't see the same level of response. And I would have to say that's been an ongoing challenge for us as one of those countries which has been so supportive of Ukraine to say, well, we can actually be supportive of more than one group at a time. And I think Canada's immigration policies and our refugee policies have helped us in terms of our own credibility as a country in saying, look, here's what we're doing across the board. We have, subject to what happens this afternoon at 4 o'clock, we have maintained a very high level of support for assistance to a number of countries. We have maintained our emergency assistance. We've maintained and increased our support for the humanitarian agency, for OCHA, not only in the work that it does in Ukraine, but throughout the world. And our overall share of the UN budget remains very high. We're among the top 10 donors to the United Nations and all of its agencies. So we're keeping a strong position in talking to African countries and Asian countries and others who are recipients of a large amount of food products and other things from the region to say we're doing what we can to help. But I don't think anyone should underestimate the impact of the food inflation, the impact of the cost of inputs into agriculture, and the overall impact this is having on developing countries. It's had a serious impact on their financial and economic and social situation, and I don't think we should underestimate it.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you. I hope that I will be able to benefit from that same magnanimous approach to timing. I'm very happy to see you. I've been waiting for your appearance for quite some time, and I'd asked to hear from you before your nomination as ambassador and permanent representative to the UN so that you could present your vision on this mandate before taking up these duties. But unfortunately, for many reasons that I won't go into here, that was not possible. So finally, we are able to see you amongst us and hear from you. From my point of view, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken, I believe your role is to represent the interests of the Government of Canada, but to present a positive image of Canada abroad and to keep friendly and respectful relations with foreign states, in particular with our allies. But as you know, there are two visions, two concepts of coexistence within this country. There's a vision that's more multiculturalist, drawing inspiration from Anglo-Saxon traditions, and then another vision based more on secularism, which draws on the French Republican tradition. And I would say that these two visions both need to be respected. One is not better than the other. They need to be respected in light of the people who, for the moment, make up this country. But on the 12th of December 2021, you took up a tweet from Ms. El-Gawabi, who was not yet appointed as special representative for Canada to counter Islamophobia, but already she was criticizing Quebec as regards Bill C-21, and you stated
discriminatory meaning to this law. It clearly runs counter to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Première question.
So my first question, do you have the impression that with that type of statement, you have tainted not just Quebec's image abroad, but actually Canada's image abroad?
Pas du tout.
Not at all. As the response, I would say, first of all, Mr. Bergeron, that there's lots of different visions of Canada, lots of different ideas about Canada, and you've just described two of these, but we could cover 10 or 12 different visions or more. So I think it's important to reflect that. Since the start of my public career, I've always talked about the importance of respecting human rights and the importance to respect pluralism, which is at the core of Canada, I believe, and to respect the specificity of Quebec. And I've fought for that for a long time during constitutional debates, both when I was a federal MP and also when I was Premier of Ontario. I was actively involved in discussions on the Charlottetown Agreement. So throughout my life, I've expressed my respect for the specificity of Quebec as a distinct nation. I am a convinced federalist, but for me, federalism does not mean that we need to have a centralist government, but rather we need to have a federal government that respects the differences throughout Canada and respects the competence of provinces. That has always been the position that I've taken up. Then on this question of the tweet that you've mentioned, as is the case in all of my tweets, I was expressing a personal point of view. I work closely with women who wear the hijab, who are members of the Public Service of Canada, and naturally I will continue to support the work that they're doing to oppose that. But I will leave the specific question of the bill that's now before the courts of Quebec and Canada. I will leave the discussion up to the courts on this. But to be quite frank, I've always had a great deal of respect for diversity of opinions in Quebec. And as Madame Desbiens said when she was here last week, as part of the delegation for the water conference, I always respect all those who come from the Canadian Parliament with their particular opinions. And of course, I followed the debate that ensued after my tweet. I don't want to drag out this debate. That's not my intention. I'm not going to do it today. Well, I regret the fact that we haven't been able to have an exchange person, because I know that you do come up to Ottawa and I was able to meet you in the parliamentary restaurant. I'd hoped that we'd be able to see you in person. You opened up the door to that, to have a lengthier discussion at some point in the future. But I'd like to cite something that came out on the 13th of December in the Journal de Montréal, where it said that in several European countries, in France, Belgium, in Swiss cantons, and also in the German Länder, to just cite a few, they have legislation which is very similar to Bill 21, and sometimes they go even further than Bill 21 when forbidding the wearing of religious symbols in public spaces. So in your role as ambassador, would you say that French secularism is discriminatory and runs counter the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Point of order.
Answer in less than 30 seconds. Yes.
Je dirais qu'il y a
Well, I would say that there will always be differences when it comes to the multicultural policy, but there's one thing that you said. You said that the idea of multiculturalism is an Anglo-Saxon idea, and I completely disagree with that opinion that you've just expressed, MP, with all due respect. But we live in a democracy, so there will be different points of view. I will continue to defend the position of Canada and the position of the provinces, as well as the diversity of Canada, which lies at the heart of my activities in New York. And I'm always ready to come back whenever you wish to see me.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray.
Excellence,
Mr.
quant à la
Bergeron.
question que je viens de vous poser.
Excellency, thank you on that question.
Ms. McPherson, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us today. I also wanted to take a moment to thank you for the work that you've done with regards to Ukraine. I was there recently. I saw, just as you described, that civilian targets have been the target of Russia. It's a horrendous war, and I appreciate your voice on that. And Ambassador, you spoke a lot about how the world is deeply troubled and all of the challenges that we face. And one of the concerns that I have as a Canadian is I don't understand our response to human rights around the world. It doesn't seem equitable. It doesn't seem fair. It seems like we pick and choose when we protect human rights and when we don't. So the first few questions I'd like to ask you about is with regards to your role within the United Nations, with regards to Canada's record of voting with regards to Israel and Palestine. I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that I have some concerns about that. In recent years, Canada has voted against resolutions that call on the international community to increase humanitarian assistance to Palestine. We've voted against a call that urges Israel to stop violating international law in occupied territories. We voted against reaffirming that Israel's settlements are illegal and an obstacle to peace. And we have voted against urging Israel to comply with provisions of international law. Ambassador, Canada is in a minority of votes with these resolutions. We've joined Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Togo, Palau. We have not joined Norway, Sweden, Germany, the UK, France, Denmark. This year in particular, Canada voted against a resolution calling on the International Court of Justice to seek simply an advisory opinion on the illegality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory. I remind you, Ambassador, that Canada is very strongly calling for justice for Ukraine. I have been part of that call. We all in this place have been part of that call, but I don't understand why we have a different lens for different regions. Can you explain to me why Canada continues to vote against calls for justice and for Palestinian human rights? And will Canada's vote change in the coming year as a result of the dangerous policies of the extreme right-wing government in Israel and the growing crisis, a crisis that is negatively impacting both Israelis and Palestinians?
I'd make a couple of points in response to your question. The first one is that the decisions on how we vote are made by the government of Canada, by the minister, by discussions in the Prime Minister's office and elsewhere. And I think that those discussions should best be held on the floor of the House of Commons. I'm not here to debate with you about one vote or another. I would take issue with one comment that you've made, which is that our position on human rights is inconsistent as it relates to the situation in the Middle East. Our position with respect to the Middle East is very clear. It's set out on the website of the Department of Foreign Affairs. It's very clearly stated with respect to our support for two states, for two peoples, which has been our position since the late 1940s. The governments, both in Mr. Martin's years and Mr. Harper's years and now Mr. Trudeau's time, the government had made a decision some time ago that we were not going to pick and choose between a whole slew of resolutions that are placed.
Sorry to interrupt, sir, but with all due respect, you are inconsistent in your voting.
Am I not allowed to respond, Madam?
Yes, you may. Go ahead.
I didn't interrupt you, and you'll forgive me if I respond by saying I think that the decision that we made with respect to how we vote on the Middle East is a decision that we've made to say, look, we're not going to pick and choose between a number of resolutions. That's the position that the government has taken at the moment. Whether that position changes or not, I don't know. But I'm happy to tell you that the government of Canada has been very consistent. And in fact, I tweeted about it 2 days ago. We believe the rule of law should protect everyone in Israel and Palestine. We believe that everyone should be protected by the rule of law. And we believe that it's critically important that there be two states for two peoples. We disagree profoundly with those people who say the Palestinians do not have a right to self-determination. We believe that they do. And we believe that the parties have to decide, and together under the rubric of international law, how they are going to negotiate their way to a better solution. The fact that they've not
Mr. Ambassador, I am going to interrupt you, and you know the deal. You know that we only have limited amounts of time for our questions. So I do want to make sure that we don't run out of time. Knowing the reality right now, first of all, I will say that I do find that the voting has been incredibly inconsistent with the two-state policy, as I outlined already. But extremists within the Israeli government are now in charge of security inside Israel Israel in the occupied territories, and they are threatening annexation of Palestinian territory in violation, as you know, of international law. Just yesterday, the leader of the Israeli government promised to create a militia under the control of the extremist Ben-Gvir. The Israeli government is telling us very clearly that they plan to continue to violate international law and the very principles of the United Nations. So how can we continue to justify this? One thing I'd also just like to point out, that thousands of people in Israel, and in fact Jews around the world, are protesting against what this government is doing. So surely the Canadian government can have the courage to actually vote with the Israeli people and against some of these very far-right decisions.
Well, there's a number of things you're commenting on. One of them has to do with the internal decisions of the Israeli government with respect to the internal politics of Israel, which I'm not going to spend a long time commenting on. But with respect to the impact on the West Bank and Gaza, the impact on the Palestinian people living in that part of the country and that part of the world, and the people who are there. First of all, any annexation is illegal. Canada's position is very clear on that, and we've been very clear with respect to any prospect of an annexation. And I have to express my own deep concern with respect to some activities which amount to de facto annexation. I think that's something we have to pay attention to as a government. And the final decisions with respect to votes, as I said before, are going to be made by the government. They're not made by the mission here in New York. Those are decisions that are made by the government of Canada, and that's where the debate should be taken.
Do you agree
place.
with those decisions,
Thank you,
Ambassador?
Ms. McPherson, you're out of time.
I don't have the luxury of agreeing or disagreeing. I have the luxury of doing what is the position of the government of Canada, and of explaining that as best I can.
Mr. Ambassador, now we go to second round of questioning. For this round, each member has 4 minutes, and we start off with MP Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador, for joining us today. You're the one that raised that your public service began in the last century, so I'll acknowledge that I began intersecting with your government in Ontario also in the last decade of the last century, particularly with your Minister Buchanan, and I'll come back to food in a moment. But I want to start with the Wagner Group. Their presence is being felt throughout sub-Saharan Africa, many other parts of the world. In particular, of course, Russia is now using them in Ukraine. A recent study that we just completed here at the Foreign Affairs Committee recommended that they be listed as a terrorist group. Can you comment, please?
Well, thank you, Mr. Epp, and it's good to see you again. Any determination of a terrorist listing is made by your colleagues in Ottawa, and that's something I think that the government will have. I'm sure they'll have a very serious look at it. The use of a private army anywhere in the world is a source of concern. The use of the Wagner Group is a particular concern because of their record, because of the way they conduct themselves and the way they have conducted themselves. And the fact that they're being widely used in Africa is a source of tremendous concern to me and tremendous concern to the government. I think, can be partly explained by the challenge facing peacekeeping. And the Secretary General is going to be releasing a report in the next few weeks on the future of overall peacekeeping in the UN system. And we will be joining very vigorously in that discussion because I think we all have a lot of concern about ensuring the public effectiveness of peacekeeping. One has to say that the government of Mali made a decision to invite the Wagner Group in. The Wagner Group is also active in the Central African Republic. And the overall situation in the Sahel and in the other parts of Africa is a source of tremendous concern to us as we look at what the impacts have been. But on the particular question you raised about the terrorist designation, that's a decision for the federal government.
Thank you. You've commented earlier with respect to genocide that you have no issues declaring your opinion on that. Can I ask your opinion of genocide with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, there are a lot of genocidal elements to it. There's no question about that. The disrespect for culture, the disrespect for children, the abduction of children, the kidnapping case, which the ICC is now taking. They're taking it as a separate war crime, but as you know, under the Genocide Convention, One of the definitions of genocide is the deliberate intent to destroy the cultural life and the cultural vitality of people's language and people's way of life. Ukrainian people have been through a lot historically, and I think we've all learned a great deal about the nature of the
Thank you,
attack
Ambassador. My time is so limited. I want to touch a bit on food and fuel.
Yeah.
Ukraine was such a breadbasket. My grandparents were all born there. That's my heritage. So many food insecure nations depend on the trade from that region. What more should Canada be doing with respect to fertilizer, fuel, et cetera, particularly for the food insecure nations of the world and also for Europe?
Well, I mean, we have opportunity. It takes time to build up the capacity, but we have an opportunity to do more. I believe that. I think the government is trying to find those opportunities as in terms of our own production. But I also think that we have been doing a lot behind the scenes to really support the Secretary General and the work that he's been doing in trying to keep the Port of Odessa open and trying to deal with the supply situation. But we now have to look at how long this war goes on and the impact that it's having on an ongoing basis. And that's where I think we really do need to look hard at what the impacts are, particularly in Africa and in parts of the Middle East and Asia, where the supply situation is extremely serious and where its ongoing impact on the economies of those countries is extremely, extremely deep. And we have to recognize that the continent of Africa, which includes so many countries, is a continent to which we're going to have to pay a lot of attention simply by virtue of what the impacts of what's taken place in the last while have been on.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We now go to Madam Bendayan. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again to you, sir, Mr. Ambassador, for returning to this committee. I would remind my colleagues that you were here in February of last year, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here again. I would like to maybe touch on something that occurred last night on Parliament Hill. We were able to meet with Masih Ahmadinejad and Nazini Bonyadi, as well as others from the Alliance for a Free and Democratic Iran. And we were, several members of the government and of Senate, encouraged as parliamentarians to use the term gender apartheid. And I noticed that you, Ambassador, used that very term here today before our committee. Can you expand on the importance of using that term and perhaps give us some sense of whether or not it is being used to an increasing extent at the United Nations and in other international fora?
It's certainly being used by a number of people. I think that for reasons around the definitions, the legal definitions, that one has to look at whether gender can be seen as part of it, because it's now identified in its legal definition as a racial term, not as a term that applies to gender. But I think the reason that I use it is because people understand instantly what it means. It's this attempt to impose an entirely misogynist ideology on countries, to deny the rights of women on a systematic basis, which we see taking place in Afghanistan, we see taking place in Iran, and we see it taking place in other countries. And quite frankly, the growth of these misogynist and authoritarian and patriarchal ideas is something we have to continue to fight against. And Canada is very active in that fight. I was speaking at a conference that Masih Ahmadinejad was speaking, and we've met on a number of had an opportunity to talk about these issues. And I've met a lot with women from Iran as well as women from Afghanistan, and Canada is very active in leading this fight, and I'm very proud of that.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I too am proud of that, and thank you for leading the charge at the United Nations and representing us so well, and in representing Canada's views with respect to what is happening in Iran. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the fact that only a few days ago, President Biden came to Ottawa and made an address to Parliament. In his address, he concluded by saying that we have an incredible opportunity, and I'll quote him, "We have an incredible opportunity to work together so Canada and the United States can source and supply here in North America everything we need for reliable and resilient supply chains. Canada and the United States can do big things. We stand together, do things together, rise together, and we're going to write the future together." End of quote. I don't want to touch, of course, on what will happen at 4 p.m. this afternoon, but do you get the sense in the United Nations that Canada and the United States are not only aligned economically, but also with respect to security concerns, and also with respect to all manner and all aspects of our relationship? And do you get that sense today in the halls that you are in, that Canada and the United States are very much aligned today more than ever?
Mr. Ambassador, you have less than 30 seconds, please.
We work very closely with the United States, but I want to emphasize that we work very closely with a number of countries. And we also work very closely with a number of countries with which we are not always in entire agreement, but there's a need for us to work closely. So I think we work here in a very multilateral context as a middle power and a country that's so deeply dedicated to the principles of multilateralism and the rule of law. But of course, the United States is a very important partner for us.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to underline that I find that to be a very interesting question from the NDP about the fact that you seem to have a very bold geometric vision when it comes to promoting human rights, and also what you feel that you can actually comment on in a public arena, and where you don't feel authorized to make certain personal comments in public arena on certain issues. So I'd like to put a question to you. Would you say that secularism, as practiced in France, is discriminatory? And does it run counter to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights? That's my question once again. Well, I would say the way in which we defend pluralism and the fact that we're a multiracial and multicultural country, I believe, is an important principle. And I hope that you have a right to your opinions, and the Quebec government has the right within its competence to take a decision. It's up to the court to now decide whether it's constitutional or not, this position that's been adopted by the Quebec government. But at the same time, you have to accept the fact that there are many Canadians who do not agree with this policy. So I've taken a moment to defend once again the principle of multiculturalism and the multiracial and pluralistic vision of Canada. I believe it's an important principle. Is Canada equal to Europe? No. We've got a different experience from Europe. And Canada is not exactly in the same position as others. I agree with that, and I agree that people have the right to practice their religion and can be a good member of any faith group and also serve the state. And this idea that we have to choose between our religious identity and our democratic identity is something that I do not accept. I believe that people can practice both, and I fully accept that we have this right. Your Excellency, I would like to point out that I totally agree with you about the fact that people can practice the religion of their choice and also serve the state. But what we're driving at here is the question of wearing religious symbols when they're exercising their duties, and that needs to be respected.
Ms. McPherson, you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Again, Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today. Ambassador Ray, in 2014, you were, I know you've done quite a lot of work on disarmament, but in 2014, you were a member of this committee when it studied Canada's proposed cluster munition legislation. Right now, this committee is undertaking work where we are reviewing legislation that will be looking at similar pieces. At that time, you expressed your opposition to Clause 11. Clause 11 of the bill, which permits Canadian Force members to order the use of these weapons, of cluster munition weapons. You said that this stands in stark, and I quote, stands in stark contradiction with the fact that Canada is opposed to the use of these bombs. I'm bringing forward an amendment to this bill that's before us, and that would fix finally the cluster munitions bill in a section that you once said had a serious problem. Will your government be supporting this amendment? Do you know?
I have no idea, and I appreciate. I've been in politics long enough in a previous life to know what a gotcha question is like. So congratulations. But the problem with my life is that my every thought is in print, so you will always find me having said something, and you can use it any way you like.
Well, to be fair, I review all of the work that many of our great leaders have brought forward. So there you have it.
It's all on the public record, and you're certainly entitled to quote from it. But I'm not going to get into the middle of a current debate that's in front of the committee.
Record from 2014. I'm just wondering whether or not your opinion has changed since then.
I have not changed my mind since then. No, personally, no, my mind has not been changed.
Do you believe that by having the cluster munitions, having this Clause 11 within the legislation, that actually puts our military personnel in a precarious ethical situation where they are often asked to, or they could be asked to transport, to use, to be part of a practice of using the cluster munitions?
If you could answer in less than 20 seconds, Mr. Ambassador.
I really don't think it's fair to expect you to answer that question the way you posed it. I said what I said when I said it. I have not changed my mind, but it's up to the committee and it's up to the people who are working in the committee to decide how they're going to vote and what they're going to do. What the position of the current government is, frankly, I have not discussed it with them, and I've not been asked for my opinion one way or the other. So I'll let you solve it.
It is good that your opinion has not changed. Thank you.
We now go to MP Cramp Nyman. You have 2 minutes.
Good morning, Ambassador Ray. Back in February 23rd of 2022, you acknowledged that it's never too late to stop and it's never too late to make a turn for diplomacy. So I think we can recognize together that with Russia only showing more signs of sustaining its military campaign in Ukraine, the hope of any diplomatic pathways is weakening. Could you possibly speak to our support in Ukraine? We need to support Ukraine unequivocally, and we need a very decisive win. If I could allow you to elaborate a little bit on that, and because of the nature of time, if you could also acknowledge a little bit further your comments with regards to the position of Canada in the invasion of Ukraine and how it constitutes genocide.
Well, on the genocide question, I think one has to look hard at President Putin's speeches to determine what the intent of Russia was in launching the war. And I have no doubt in my mind, based on what I've read and seen and heard him say publicly, and I've been a Putin watcher for quite a while, I don't think he recognizes the independence, the sovereignty, and the separateness of Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian people. And that's why I think that the genocide word is not inappropriate. On the question of what has Canada been doing, I think Canada's record, frankly, has been exemplary. I think on sanctions, I think on military supplies, I think our full-out support for what Ukraine needs when they need it. I think we've responded to every request. The response to the support has been political. It's been military. It's been diplomatic. It's been humanitarian. It's covered the full force of what needs to be done. Could we do more? Of course, everyone can do more, and we will do more. I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear in all of his statements about how we're ready to respond and do it to respond in an effective way.
Thank you so much. Maybe just could you confirm?
I'm sorry, you're out of time.
Thank you.
Over 2 minutes. Thank you. So for the last question, we go to MP Zuberi. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador Ray, for being here. It was good seeing you during Biden's address, President Biden's address in Ottawa last week. I wanted to ask around a question around Haiti. The subcommittee of this Foreign Affairs Committee has been studying Haiti. If you can just elaborate a bit about the situation as it is currently, and how you see things going to the future for states that are involved within the region.
The situation in Haiti is very serious. The gangs have taken over much of the country and most of Port-au-Prince. The condition facing women and children in the country is serious. The lack of food is serious. It's a truly deeply troubling situation. We are responding with a basic principle in mind, and that is, it's really a primary responsibility of the government and, frankly, the people of Haiti and the political leadership of Haiti to take the assistance that's being offered and to do everything they can to restore public order and then to restore a democratic path for the country towards an election. There are people who say the Haitians can't do it on their own. I think the government has indicated we want to try to make that happen. We want to create the conditions in which that can happen. And the support that we're offering is frankly unprecedented, and we're going to do more. We're working hard to make sure that civil order can be restored, but also that civil rights can be maintained. We don't think that order and rights are contradictory. We think you need to have both. You need to have public safety, but you also need to make sure you have democratic rights that are respected. Right now, the gang violence is terrible, and the disrespect by the gangs for the people of Haiti is appalling. And so we have to do everything we can to disrupt the gangs, but to do it in a way that puts the forces of Haiti in the forefront. The reason we're doing that is because there's a serious consequence to the kind of other forms of intervention that we need to appreciate. And not all previous interventions have been successful and sustainable. And so it's that principle of sustainability that we have to continue to keep our focus on, and that's really what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. On that note, that brings our questions to an end. As always, it was a great pleasure and a great honor to have you here with our committee. And thank you for all the tremendous work you're doing down in New York and for leading the charge, as you always do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, just on a personal note, say that I was delighted, Mr. Chairman, that you were able to join us in New York during the time of the debate on Iran. I want to stress to other members that you are all welcome to if you can, come to sessions of the General Assembly, to sessions of the UN. We will always welcome you here and find ways of providing you with the assistance that you would like to have. And as I said before, I'm quite happy to come back to the committee. It's sometimes difficult to schedule, not just for me, but apparently for you as well. But I'm more than happy to do that. And I really appreciate the chance to be with you today. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So we will now suspend for a couple of minutes before we move on to the second panel. It will be no more than 2 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, November 16th, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-281. This, of course, is an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Broadcasting Act, and the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome our two esteemed panelists. First, we have Mr. Alex Neve, who, as you all know, is the Senior Fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. We also have with us from the Foundation of Safeguard Defenders, we have Ms. Laura Harth, who is the campaign director and was here last week as well, appearing as a witness before another committee. We're very grateful to have you both. First, we will start off with opening remarks by each of you, after which it will be followed by questions from the members, and you will each have 5 minutes. Once you're very close to the end of your time slot, I will put this up and would be grateful if you wrapped up your replies or comments as soon as possible. So given that Mr. Neve is here in person, Mr. Neve, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought you were going to suggest you would be taking a selfie of us or something. It's a pleasure to be here with you as you look at this important legislation. Since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights almost 75 years ago, states have developed an extensive range of standards, bodies, and processes for protecting human rights internationally. There are 18 core UN human rights treaties and optional protocols. 10 expert committees oversee state compliance with those treaties. The UN Human Rights Council meets 3 times per year, as well as frequent special sessions. The Council's Universal Periodic Review process reviews the human rights record of every UN member state once every 4.5 years. The Council's Special Procedures system of 45 thematic and 14 country-focused independent experts rigorously scrutinizes human rights challenges around the world, and independent commissions of inquiry established by the Council conduct in-depth investigations of situations of widespread human rights violations around the world. All of that, yet our world continues to face massive human rights challenges. Governments on every continent show contempt for the binding obligations they have assumed. Accountability and enforcement are weak, relying primarily on notions of good faith and self-interest. Canada has played a key role in advancing much of that progress and is widely respected as an international human rights champion, but there is so much more we can and must do. One side of that, not the focus of today's session, is that we absolutely must set a stronger example of effectively implementing our own international human rights obligations domestically. The other dimension is that while Canadian governments speak about the importance of human rights in our foreign policy, we do not back that up with transparent and accountable commitments, plans, and reporting to demonstrate concretely that human rights come first for Canada on the world stage. Bill C-281 takes a step in that direction on 2 fronts. An annual report outlining measures the government takes to advance international human rights, and a list of prisoners of conscience for whose release Canada is advocating. I believe these 2 proposals can and should go further. With respect to the first, an annual report that is not grounded in a strong foundational framework will, I fear, come up short. That is why advocates have called on Canada for many years to adopt a whole-of-government international human rights action plan, developed on the basis of consultations with civil society and Indigenous peoples organizations, updated on a regular basis, and subject to annual progress reports, which are reviewed by Parliament and released publicly. I would suggest an amendment to Bill C-281 to require the development of just such an action plan and reporting processes of that nature. With respect to the second provision, there are a number of considerations to keep in mind, but let me highlight just two. First, prisoner of conscience, a powerful term that comes out of decades of campaigning by Amnesty International, is nevertheless not defined in law. There are many unjustly detained prisoners whose situation may well fall outside that term, such as individuals facing torture, disappearances, or the death penalty. I would suggest instead that the focus be on individuals who are detained or facing other treatment that contravenes international human rights obligations. Second, there are several strategic considerations related to publicizing prisoner lists. While we do absolutely need more transparency and accountability, there are also legitimate reasons for caution and confidentiality. Some prisoners' situations may benefit from publicity, others not. I worry about the message that may be conveyed if a case doesn't appear on the list, whatever the reason for that may be. Having been involved over many decades in efforts to encourage Canadian diplomacy with respect to prisoner cases, including of Canadian citizens who are unjustly imprisoned abroad, a more pressing concern for me has been the failure and even refusal to provide meaningful information to family members, lawyers, and civil society groups actively engaged on particular cases. Instead of focusing only on a public list of prisoners' names, I would urge that Bill C-281 be amended to mandate development of a clear strategy for Canadian government diplomacy on prisoner cases, perhaps to be included in the International Human Rights Action Plan, that incorporates standards, one, to ensure consistency, including with respect to public advocacy, two, for stronger engagement with families, lawyers, and civil society working on prisoner cases, and three, to guide public reporting of the government's efforts, including numbers of cases taken up, activities undertaken, and the human rights concerns involved. Thank you. Those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neve. Now we go to Ms. Harth. You have 5 minutes as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of this committee for the opportunity to testify again on behalf of Safeguard Defenders. As you may know, we aim to counter grave human rights violations, including through the use of existing regulatory frameworks. And this effort aims not only at holding perpetrators of human rights violations accountable, but also to uphold the international rules-based order, which is firmly set within the confines of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. As Mr. Neve just rightly pointed out, this is something pertaining as much to foreign policy as to ensuring that those standards are upheld across societies back at home in our democracies. Allow me, therefore, to dedicate this testimony to an issue pertaining to the Broadcasting Act, which we understand an amendment is being proposed to. After the PRC Xi Jinping came to power, CCTV and its global arm CGTN began to systematically broadcast forced confessions of human rights defenders, foreign targets, and also non-politically motivated suspects. Our 2018 report, Scripted and Staged, analyzed the recordings of 45 confession broadcasts between 2013 and 2018, including interviews with a dozen people who had been victims or members of their families. Confessions are routinely made before trial, before any lawyers have been met, and often even before formal arrest. Such confessions, which are written by the police, are extracted through threats, torture, and fear, including the persecution of relatives and family members. They violate the fundamental rights to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, the right to remain silent, and the right not to self-incriminate. As we managed to successfully demonstrate before the UK's broadcasting regulator, Ofcom, China's party media outlets, CGTN and CCTV, are not mere broadcasters of such confessions, but an active participant in their scripting and staging, thereby directly participating in the violation of internationally recognized human rights. Following our complaints, that same UK regulator imposed a series of fines on the broadcasters for its airing of such forced televised confessions. Other fines were imposed for their gravely biased reporting of the Hong Kong democracy protests. In addition, we presented evidence on the direct editorial control of the outlets by the Communist Party of China following a policy reform in 2018, evidence that CGTN was unable to negate. For the interest of this committee, suffice it to point to CGTN's annual corporate social responsibility reports, which repeatedly state as its mission goal that of upholding the Communist Party of China with Xi Jinping at its core. On that basis, and thanks to the UK's applicable regulatory framework, Ofcom managed to remove their UK broadcasting license in early 2021, as no channels that are directly owned or controlled by political parties may air in the UK. Now, it is important to point out that similar complaints and letters by multiple victims of such forced televised confessions were sent to individual broadcasting operators airing some or all of CGTN and CCTV's content. Based on their corporate social responsibilities, such as under the UN's Global Compact, operators in Australia, Sweden, and Norway autonomously decided to scrap their offering from their packages. Formal regulatory complaints on forced televised confessions are still underway in France and Canada. Now, it is important to note that while regulators in democratic countries are largely bound to the same human rights tenets, precise broadcasting regulations vary significantly, limiting the extent to which regulators are able to intervene. Nonetheless, as an organization, we have found that regulatory action in these instances is a very impactful toolkit when they are used. We have seen CGTN, if not completely ending this behavior, significantly reducing their televised airing of forced confessions. CCTV, which has not been touched by regulatory action so far, has continued its producing and international airing of forced televised confessions unabated, including with 26 new forced televised confessions just in January of this year, which is the object of our latest complaint to the French regulator. Now, we therefore firmly support any efforts to beef up regulatory frameworks to ensure that broadcasting regulators have all the necessary tools to effectively act against such blatant abuse of human rights for propaganda and disinformation purposes in today's global media landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now go to questions from the members. The first question goes to MP Chong. You have 4 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for your opening statements. I'm going to ask Ms. Barth some questions. I'd love to ask you, Mr. Neb, some questions, but I don't have a lot of time. But I thought you made some very good points on the need for transparent reporting from Global Affairs Canada. I note the Auditor General's report of this week highlighting exactly that with respect to the government's feminist international assistance policy. So thank you for that testimony. I'd like to ask our witness about Safeguard Defenders' complaint with the CRTC. They registered a complaint regarding the broadcasting of forced confessions on CGTN in Canada. Can you tell us what the latest is with that complaint?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for that question. I won't go into too much detail, as obviously this is an ongoing complaint, but we lodged our original complaint in December 2019. This original complaint regarded one particular forced confession that was televised, but also highlighted the broader use by CCTV4 and CGTN of such forced televised confessions, also going back to the CRTC's statements when it had allowed the first airing of CCTV4 and later CGTN in Canada. We sent a follow-up letter in 2021 when Ofcom made its decision. We also sent some follow-up letters by victims to, in particular, Rogers, which has been airing some of these channels. Now, the latest is that we have understood that at the beginning of this year, the Chinese counterpart has responded to some of CRTC's questions. We have, following receiving that response from CRTC, have offered to, respond to some of the claims that CGTN made in that response to CRTC. But we have not received any further response at the moment.
Yeah, Ms. Harth, what is taking so long? You mentioned in your opening comments, and it's been widely reported on, that Ofcom, the United Kingdom's CRTC, heard a similar complaint, and within a very short amount of time made a decision to remove the license for CGTN. You registered your complaint 4 years ago. Like, what is taking so long? It's almost half a decade now for this to be dealt with.
Yeah, with all due respect, Mr. Chong, I think that's a question that should be answered by CRTC rather than us.
Well,
we have obviously
I appreciate
several times.
I appreciate that answer. I know last year there's been often complaints about not just CGTN, but also authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters like Russia Today. And I note that after the war in Ukraine broke out on February 24th of last year, within about a week and a half, 2 weeks, the Government of Canada, in particular the Minister of Canadian Heritage, issued an order in Council ordering and directing the CRTC under Section 15 of the Broadcasting Act to review RT's license. And within weeks, RT had its license removed from the list of non-Canadian programming. So I'm wondering why it's taking so long to deal with this complaint with CGTN, and why the government isn't applying the same approach to CGTN under the existing Broadcasting Act.
So no question? We're good. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chong. So we now go to Dr. Fry. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. As said before, Mr. Neve makes some compelling points, so I'm not going to question him. But I am very interested in asking Ms. Harth a question. We know that there have been many people who have opposed certain bills that have come through the House by the Minister of Canadian Heritage with regard to some of the foreign multinationals that have actually brought about certain information, including people like Netflix, etc. My concern is this: how do you balance, in good legislation, freedom of the press with the ability to curb disinformation and propaganda, as you say? I would like to ask that question, and I'd like to give you the time to answer it, because I think that is at the heart of the question. How do you keep freedom of the press, and how do you do this, given that CRTC is a quasi-judicial body and cannot be made to do anything by the Government of Canada? It has, as being a quasi-judicial body, it's in fact considered interference when the government tries to tell CRTC exactly what to do. How do we square that circle on freedom of the press and disinformation and propaganda on the other hand? It's a need. I agree with the need to do it, but how do we do it? Do you have any ideas, any clear ways of doing this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this question. For us, it's been very important, and I think from our complaints as well, you will see we have specifically targeted, in a way, targeted is not a word, but called out CCTV4 and CGTN for its airing of these forced televised confessions. When it comes to other complaints, for example, the one on the Hong Kong protests that were aired by CGTN and that have been the object of complaints in the UK and by sanctions by the regulator Ofcom, that goes more into the bias disinformation area of things. But so we are dealing with the same question. We understand that this is very difficult. However, in the case of CGTN and CCTV4, we are very clearly dealing with what are blatant human rights violations. And I think if you'll allow me very briefly to recall what the CRTC statements was in 2006, when after a lengthy review, they made a decision to allow the addition of CCTV4 to the digital broadcast list. It said that the Commission has found several instances of the service broadcasting content that, in its view, constitutes abusive comment. These date back to 1999 and 2001, and there is no evidence of such instances aired by CCTV4 since that time. I will briefly resume. In light of the above, the Commission approves the request, but considers it unnecessary to impose specific conditions on its distribution in addition to those usually applicable to such services on such lists. Now, when it added CGTN, it noted the Commission that these packages should obey the laws of every country in which its services are broadcast and will comply with the provision of the relevant codes that govern Canadian broadcasts. However, the Commission will be prepared to exercise the removal of its right to remove a service from the list if it finds that abusive comment has been aired on the service while it is distributed in Canada. So these are the statements by the CRTC at the time, and those are the kind of statements that we look to when it comes to this airing of forced televised confessions, which are clearly a violation that has been taking place, including on Canadian airwaves. So it's not a complete response to how do we deal with the disinformation and propaganda, which is another question still, but this is really about upholding broadcasting regulations and making sure that no human rights violations are actually being aired through Canadian airwaves.
And how, just
Thank you, Dr. Fry. I'm afraid you're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 4 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for shedding light. That's been very relevant and interesting vis-à-vis this bill. Mr. Neve, together in a previous life, we worked on a certain number of files. William Sampson, for example, where in that particular case, it was desirable to really play this out very subtly rather than going public with all of that so that we could continue with our approach there. So I had a concern that I expressed last week to the sponsor of this bill, and I also expressed it vis-à-vis the global affairs officials. And thank you very much for your excellent suggestions for amendments that you've shared today. I think that they would meet some of the concerns that I raised last week, in particular when it comes to the first elements in this bill. I would like to come back to something they said in the Globe and Mail on the 14th of January last on the effects of the Magnitsky Law. You've said that the Canadian government, I would like to cite, is hesitant to impose sanctions on the culpable people within the People's Republic of China under the Magnitsky Law. And that's the end of the citation. But the government has imposed sanctions through the Special Economic Measures Act on 4 Chinese individuals as well as 1 Chinese entity. So what do you think we're actually achieving when we impose sanctions through the Magnitsky Act that we're not able to achieve when we impose sanctions through the Special Economic Measures Act?
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Bergeron, and
thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Of the work on William Sampson's case more than 20 years ago, but I think it does remind us that there are times when publicity is not in the strategic interests of the prisoner concerned necessarily. With respect to the Magnitsky Act and I guess China, but I think your question is broader than that. I think the Magnitsky Act obviously offers a fuller and much more targeted set of sanctions, the focus on individuals who are responsible, the very specific tying of the sanction to concerns about international human rights violations, I think is very important and very useful. I think there is both actual impact and symbolic impact with sanctions. I think that's always the case with sanctions, but that certainly is so with the Magnitsky Act provisions. I mean, certainly it may well have direct implications for the person concerned. We know, though, in many instances, that's probably not the case. They don't have any assets or travel plans or other measures that are directly going to be implicated, but it has sent a very strong message globally that Canada is watching, that Canada is concerned about that individual's conduct with respect to international human rights, and is prepared to back that up with something beyond rhetoric and actually impose some consequences, which, of course, as I said in my opening remarks, the one thing that is still so woefully lacking when it comes to the international human rights system is enforcement and accountability. And those provisions take us in that direction, and they take us in that direction at a level which really can hit hard, and that is individual accountability and responsibility.
And what explains this hesitancy that you identified in your article?
Well, I think with respect to China, it's broader than issues around the Magnitsky Act, and it's nothing limited to this government. It's something we've been concerned about whoever is in power, and that is there is reluctance to hit hard when it comes to China. China has clout and influence that makes governments nervous to say hard-hitting things about human rights, let alone to actually impose sanctions on individuals. And I think we're starting to see that change, and that's vitally important.
Thank you. We next go to Madam McPherson. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Neef, thank you very much for being here. I think everyone in this room recognizes you as one of the preeminent voices for human rights defense in this country. So we deeply appreciate that you're sharing your expertise with us at this point. One of the things I wanted to raise first, and I think it's so important that we continually remember that at the end of the day, when we talk about prisoners, that these are family members, these are fathers, these are children, these are individuals. Yesterday, I had a heartbreaking meeting with some Turkish individuals who had been arbitrarily detained. I was meeting as well with Enes Kanter Freedom, who has been an incredible ally for these people. I know you've told me about Dong Guangping. I want you just to speak a little bit about what this legislation will mean and you know, if we can improve it to a place that this will actually help those human rights defenders and those that have been arbitrarily detained.
Dong Guangping in 2 minutes. Dong Guangping is an incredible Chinese human rights defender who has been imprisoned 3 times in China because of his advocacy, a lot of which has been related to Tiananmen Square. He and his wife and daughter escaped from China in 2015, and he almost made it to Canada at the time. He was accepted for refugee resettlement, but the Thai government, which is where they were in hiding, unfortunately handed him over to Chinese officials just days before he was to fly to Canada. He was sent back to China and imprisoned again. He was then released from that third period of imprisonment, was determined to once again find his way to freedom, especially given that his wife and daughter were now here in Canada. Obviously, he wanted to be with them. His first incredible attempt was to actually swim to freedom. He tried to swim off the coast of China to reach an offshore island controlled by Taiwan. He almost drowned. He didn't make it. He was rescued by a fishing boat and taken back to China. He tried another time, this time going overland to Vietnam, where he remained in hiding for 2.5 years, enduring COVID, for instance, concerned about not coming to the attention of Vietnamese officials, while the Canadian government carefully tried to see what they could do to encourage Vietnam to let him leave the country and come to Canada. Unfortunately, on August the 24th of last year, so this is 7 months ago, while it looked like his departure for Canada was drawing closer, he was arrested by Vietnamese police, and there has been no word of him since. To connect it up with Bill C-281, I think the family and certainly advocates have very much welcomed Canada's involvement in trying to advocate on his behalf, and in particular, Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Joly raised it at high levels back in the fall when they were in Southeast Asia for a number of summits. But beyond that, it's been very difficult for the family to have any clarity as to what is or is not being done. There's assurances that it's being taken up, but there's never any reporting as to what that looks like, no indication as to what the results or outcome is, and I think it really leaves the family very much in the dark, which one of the reasons why I emphasized that the bill could be significantly strengthened if it paid attention to that side of this. How do we ensure that family members and advocates get more reliable information?
Thank you. And, given the concerns of families of those detained, the concerns of civil society that they've made regarding the transparency of this government, would you agree that we need to have included in an annual report a description of the efforts that the minister has made to improve consistency and transparency in human rights advocacy and to improve accountability to families of those detained and to civil society?
I think absolutely a description of those kinds of initiatives would be really important. And I would take one step back and say that would be even stronger if it was on the basis of some sort of strategy that was developed. And I think right now things, even when there's good intentions and good efforts made with respect to prisoner advocacy, it's often ad hoc. And I think all concerned would benefit from a clearer strategy which brings some consistency, fundamental principles, and some details around how family members are going to be engaged, when and in what circumstances to go public with cases, etc.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. We now go to the second round of questions. For this round, each member will receive 3 minutes. And we start off with Mr. Jennings, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with a comment on the freedom of the press issue, and then, Ms. Harth, I'll welcome your response to that. I think freedom of the press is very important. A few points, though, in the context of this bill. One is that freedom of the press doesn't oblige that everybody gets a public broadcasting license. There are certain rules around public broadcasting licenses. You can still get RT in Canada. You can get it online. I'm not promoting it. I don't think you should watch it, but it is available online. And CGTN would still be available online if the broadcast license was removed. Another way of responding to this is to say they're not the press. I mean, you can get a lot of information on conservative.ca. That's the website for a political party, but it's not a media outlet, and neither are organizations that are specifically exists to propagate the views of foreign political parties. But then also just to say that when these so-called media organizations that are not media organizations are directly involved in violating human rights themselves, they clearly would lose the good name of alleged association with the press, and just in general, the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of expression does not include the rights of foreign authoritarian governments to propagate their message in our domestic context, especially with the privilege of a broadcasting license. So I think there are some very clear distinctions between what real journalists do and what these human rights abusing foreign propaganda outlets are involved in, and there's no reason for them to have the benefit of a broadcasting license. Ms. Harth, your reaction to those reflections, please.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, allow me to quote a statement by the chairperson and chief executive officer from CRTC from March last year when Russia Today and Russia Today France were scrapped. Mr. Ian Scott said, freedom of speech and a range of perspectives are a necessary part of our democracy. However, it is a privilege and not a right to be broadcast in Canada. Foreign channels can be removed from the authorized list should their programming not be consistent with the standards to which Canadian services are held, or their continued distribution no longer serves the public interest, as was the case for Russia Today and Russia Today France. So I think that statement echoes pretty much yours, Mr. Genuis. Thank you.
And just briefly in the time I have left, CGTN also broadcasts misinformation involving Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's not just repression of people inside of China, but they're also promoting the Russian misinformation narrative. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. We have seen Chinese media outlets being used as an outlet for Russia disinformation and propaganda.
So now we go to Mr. Oliphant. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will go to Mr. Neve. Thank you for being here and advising us on the legislation. I think it's very important what you said. I want to give you a little more time on it. I'm thinking back of many years on cases we have worked on together where there have been times where it's been appropriate for government and civil society to speak loudly, and cases where it's been important for civil society to speak loudly and government to be quiet. And there have been cases where it's important for civil society and government to both be quiet to save lives. I very much appreciate your remarks regarding the publicizing of such names. And I had not thought previously about what happens if someone's name is not on the list, which could perhaps signal the wrong thing. I also very much appreciate your concern about prisoners of conscience as a not well-defined term legally, and very much appreciate your remarks regarding on how we could do that. Just want to give you the rest of my time to talk a little bit more about the positives and negatives of publishing such a list and about the naming of what we're doing.
Thank you very much. Well, you've summarized very well that there are times when publicity is absolutely the best strategy, times when it is perhaps not, and that is even for civil society. I think there's an assumption that civil society is always, full throttle to take everything very public, but there's often times when we do our advocacy quietly and behind the scenes. That said, I think, which is why I was calling for the need for a strategy in this area, that if we actually could have some very careful thinking about developing more consistent guidelines around that help governments deliberate as to when publicity is beneficial and not, what considerations are legitimate considerations and what are not. I think, rightly or wrongly, there's often a perception that some of the adversity to publicity is that it'll make things uncomfortable or more difficult, put more pressure on the government if their efforts are out there in the public domain. I'd argue that's not so much a legitimate consideration. I think what you highlighted, concerns that sometimes the publicity may make things more difficult or even put the prisoner at risk, is what we need to consider. So I think doing that work on the basis of broad consultations would be very beneficial. It would also give an opportunity to think of other strategic considerations that need attention in this area, such as the nature of the relationship with family members.
So would you support this legislation as it stands?
I think it needs amendment, but I think amendment to improve it.
Thank you. And I like the art of this. Sometimes it's an art, and it's lengthy conversations going back between civil society and government, and even within government, sometimes people in government have to push our own government. So we've found ways of imperfectly doing that, and thank you for doing that for the last several decades.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have a minute and a half, sir.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. I very much agree with you, Mr. Nivy, when you say that government of whichever stripe are hesitant about intervening when it comes to China, amongst others. But the Magnitsky Act was not actually enforced under the Conservative government, and the Liberal government has imposed sanctions under the Special Economic Measures Act. So, in the current context with this new legislation, what is preventing or holding the government back from actually imposing sanctions under the Magnitsky Act? Or is it just because everything has to be coordinated with like-minded countries?
I mean, it's a good question, and I wish I had the answer. I think your last point there is certainly a consideration, and I think it's a legitimate consideration that there that coordination with other countries, while it should not be the reason not to impose sanctions, I've got too many nots in there, but it certainly is valuable in strengthening sanctions if and when they are imposed, especially for a, we're not a big player, we're not an insignificant player, but we're not a big player. For Canada to be able to go out in coordination with other countries certainly strengthens things. I think the obstacles, especially with respect to China, as I said earlier, tend to be more political than principled. Unfortunately, I don't think it's generally because there's actually a feeling that the sanctions aren't appropriate or that they're not backed up by sufficient human rights concerns. Quite the contrary. I think there's usually wide recognition of the seriousness of the human rights concerns, but there's that reticence and that nervousness, which, as I said, is something we've seen from governments of I was going to say all, of both political stripes over the last 15 to 20 years with respect to China, of not wanting to hit hard.
Thank you. We go to the final question to Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's always my delight that I get to be the very final question. Mr. Neve, I'm going to ask you two questions, and then I'll leave the rest of the time for you. The first question, both questions are about amendments that I'll be putting forward. Given the challenge of using the term prisoners of conscience, would you agree with a wording like prisoners detained worldwide in contravention of international human rights, law, and standards? That's the first question. And the second question, I'll be introducing an amendment to eliminate the Section 11 piece from the Canadian Cluster Munitions Act. This is the section, of course, that allows for Canadian forces to transport and order the use of cluster munitions when on joint operations with non-party states. Would you support such an amendment?
So absolutely, with respect to cluster munitions, I've done field research in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I've interviewed the survivors of cluster munitions attacks. I've seen unexploded and exploded cluster munitions on the ground. They are odious. They belong nowhere in military operations, and Canada shouldn't have the slightest opening that would ever involve us in operations that even contemplate the possibility of cluster munitions being used. So I'm very supportive of that. With respect to the amendment to maybe kind of tighten up and improve upon the language currently of focusing on prisoners of conscience, I think that proposal is a good one. I might go a little bit further, though, and I think the focus on detention risks leaving out some situations. For instance, Dong Guangping's case, we actually don't know if he's detained right now. We know he's disappeared. We know he was arrested and abducted. So I think in my comments, I suggested something along the lines of individuals who are detained or experiencing other treatment in contravention of international human rights standards, just to make sure that the ambit is broad enough to capture all cases of concern.
Thank you. I believe that's my time.
Thank you very much. So on that note, wanted to thank you, Mr. Neve. Thank you, Madam Harth, for being here with us to speak on the issue of Bill C-281. We very much appreciate your time, your expertise, and your perspectives. Thank you. Now, for members, we will be going in camera for committee business. So those of you who are joining us virtually, if you could just leave and then join us again through the hyperlink that was just emailed to you. Hopefully, we can do it in a couple of minutes. So we'll suspend.
you.